Few wars in history have been remembered so clearly, yet understood so imperfectly, as the American Civil War. Beneath the familiar stories of battles and generals lies a deeper truth, one shaped by economic forces, political fears, personal ambition, and human suffering on a scale the nation had never seen before. The Civil War was not simply a fight between North and South. It was a collision of ideologies, identities, and futures. A war fought not only on battlefields, but in homes, legislatures, newspapers, and the hearts of millions. What most people think they know about the Civil War is only the surface. The real story lies in the hidden tensions, the moral contradictions, and the choices made long before the first shot was fired. The roots of the Civil War stretch back to the founding of the United States itself. From the beginning, the nation carried a contradiction at its core, a commitment to liberty alongside the institution of slavery. While the founders avoided resolving this conflict, believing compromise would preserve unity, their decision planted the seeds of future division. Over time, those seeds grew into irreconcilable differences between regions with vastly different economies, cultures, and moral outlooks. The North and South developed along separate paths. The North became increasingly industrial, urban, and economically diversified. It relied on wage labor, factories, and an expanding transportation network. The South, by contrast, remained largely agrarian, dependent on enslaved labor to sustain its plantation economy. This economic divide hardened social attitudes and political loyalties, creating two societies that increasingly struggled to understand one another. Slavery was not just a moral issue, it was a political and economic foundation. Southern wealth and influence depended on it, while Northern industrial growth increasingly clashed with its expansion. Every new territory acquired by the United States reignited the same explosive question: would slavery be allowed to expand westward? Each compromise delayed conflict but deepened resentment. By the mid-19th century, the nation was locked in a cycle of crisis. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were attempts to balance power between free and slave states. Instead, they exposed how fragile that balance had become. Violence erupted in places like Bleeding, Kansas, where settlers fought and killed one another over the future of slavery. The rise of abolitionism further intensified tensions. Abolitionists challenged not only the institution of slavery but the moral conscience of the nation. Their voices, once marginalized, grew louder and more influential. At the same time, Southern leaders increasingly viewed any challenge to slavery as an existential threat. Fear replaced compromise, and suspicion replaced dialogue. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, the breaking point arrived. Although he had promised not to abolish slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion convinced many Southern leaders that their way of life was doomed. Secession followed swiftly. State after state left the Union, forming the Confederate States of America before Lincoln even took office. The Civil War began not simply as a fight over slavery, but as a battle over the nature of the Union itself. Could states leave at will? Was the United States a voluntary association or a permanent nation? These questions would define the conflict as much as any battlefield victory or defeat. The early months of the war shattered illusions on both sides. Many believed the conflict would be short and decisive. Instead, it became the bloodiest war in American history. New technologies, rifled muskets, ironclad ships, railroads, and telegraphs made warfare more lethal and more total than ever before. Entire societies were mobilized for the fight. The human cost was staggering. Soldiers faced disease, hunger, and psychological trauma on an unprecedented scale. Civilians endured shortages, displacement, and grief. Women took on new roles as nurses, factory workers, and organizers, reshaping gender expectations in lasting ways. Enslaved people seized opportunities to escape bondage, transforming the war into a struggle for freedom. As the conflict dragged on, its meaning evolved. What began as a war to preserve the Union gradually became a war to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 marked a turning point, redefining the purpose of the war and altering international perceptions. It discouraged European powers from supporting the Confederacy and allowed formerly enslaved men to fight for their freedom in Union ranks. Behind the scenes, political tensions were constant. Lincoln faced opposition from both abolitionists who demanded immediate emancipation and conservatives who feared social upheaval. He navigated these pressures with careful timing, understanding that leadership required patience as much as principle. The Confederacy, meanwhile, struggled with its own contradictions. While fighting for states' rights, it centralized power in ways that mirrored the very government it opposed. Internal dissent, economic instability, and dwindling resources weakened its war effort. The reliance on slavery, once its strength, became a strategic liability as enslaved people fled or resisted in growing numbers. As the war progressed, its brutality intensified. Battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Chickamauga revealed the staggering human cost of modern warfare. Entire communities were changed forever. The war demanded not only soldiers' lives but also the nation's conscience. By 1864, the outcome began to take shape. Union victories, combined with effective leadership and industrial superiority, gradually broke Confederate resistance. Yet even as defeat loomed, the question of what kind of peace would follow remained unresolved. The war officially ended in 1865, but its consequences were far from over. Reconstruction presented new challenges: how to rebuild the South, integrate formerly enslaved people into civic life, and reunite a nation torn apart by violence and distrust. These challenges would shape American politics and race relations for generations. The hidden history of the Civil War lies not only in its battles but in its contradictions. It was a war fought to preserve a nation that had yet to fully define freedom. It ended slavery but left deep inequalities unresolved. It strengthened the federal government while igniting debates about states' rights that persist to this day. The Civil War transformed the United States from a loose collection of states into a more unified nation, bound by shared sacrifice and a redefined sense of purpose. It forced Americans to confront the meaning of liberty, citizenship, and national identity in ways no previous conflict had demanded. Its legacy endures in modern debates over race, democracy, and federal power. The war's unresolved questions continue to shape political discourse, social movements, and cultural memory. Understanding the Civil War is not simply about understanding the past, it is about understanding the forces that still shape the present. The hidden history of the Civil War reveals a story far more complex than heroes and villains. It is a story of fear and courage, compromise and conviction, tragedy and transformation. It reminds us that history is not made by simple choices, but by human beings struggling within the limits of their time. And in that struggle, the Civil War remains one of the most defining chapters in the American story, a conflict whose echoes still resonate, shaping the nation's identity more than a century later. As the guns finally fell silent in 1865, the United States stood at a crossroads unlike any it had faced before. Victory had preserved the Union, but peace brought new questions that would prove just as difficult as the war itself. How could a nation built on freedom reconcile with centuries of bondage? How could former enemies live side by side again? And how could a country so deeply divided redefine itself without losing its soul? Reconstruction was meant to answer those questions. In theory, it was a chance to rebuild the South, protect newly freed African Americans, and restore the Union on more just foundations. In practice, it became another battlefield, one fought through laws, politics, and social resistance rather than cannons and muskets. The promises of freedom often clashed with entrenched racism, economic hardship, and political fatigue in the North. For formerly enslaved people, freedom brought both hope and uncertainty. Millions sought education, land, and the right to participate fully in American life. Black churches, schools, and communities flourished despite overwhelming odds. Yet violent resistance emerged just as quickly. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror to undermine Reconstruction and restore white supremacy in the South, revealing how deeply the war's divisions still ran. The federal government attempted to enforce civil rights through constitutional amendments and military oversight, but public will slowly weakened. As Northern interests faded, Southern states regained control, implementing laws that restricted voting rights and enforced racial segregation. The ideals of Reconstruction were gradually eroded, leaving many of its promises unfulfilled for generations. Despite these failures, the Civil War fundamentally reshaped the meaning of the United States. Before the war, the nation was often described as a collection of states. Afterward, it became a single, indivisible entity. The federal government emerged stronger, and the concept of national citizenship took root. The idea that the Union was permanent and worth fighting for became central to American identity. The war also transformed how Americans remembered themselves. Memorials, literature, and public memory shaped competing narratives of heroism and loss. For some, the war was framed as a noble struggle for states' rights; for others, it was a moral crusade against slavery. These competing interpretations would influence politics, education, and culture for generations. Internationally, the Civil War signaled a turning point. The survival of the Union demonstrated that democratic governments could withstand internal rebellion. Movements for independence and reform around the world drew inspiration from the American experience, even as they learned from its shortcomings. The hidden history of the Civil War lies in these lasting consequences. It is found not only in battlefields and speeches, but in the unresolved questions of equality, justice, and national identity. The war reshaped the Constitution, redefined citizenship, and altered the relationship between the people and their government. More than a conflict between North and South, the Civil War was a test of whether a nation founded on ideals could survive its own contradictions. It revealed both the fragility and resilience of democracy. It showed that progress is neither simple nor guaranteed, but forged through struggle, sacrifice, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Even today, echoes of the Civil War remain embedded in American life, in debates over rights, federal authority, and the meaning of freedom itself. Understanding this hidden history allows us to see the war not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing conversation about who Americans are and who they strive to become. The Civil War did not end in 1865. Its consequences continue to shape the nation's identity, reminding us that history is not merely something we remember, it is something we live with, inherit, and are responsible for shaping anew. And so, the true legacy of the Civil War lies not only in its battles or its leaders, but in the unresolved questions it left behind. It forced a nation to confront the meaning of freedom, equality, and unity, and revealed how fragile those ideals can be when tested by fear, power, and division. The war ended slavery, but it did not end inequality. It preserved the Union, but it also exposed the deep fractures within it. What followed was not a clean resolution, but a long and difficult journey toward fulfilling the promises written into the nation's founding ideals. The hidden history of the Civil War reminds us that progress is rarely linear. It is shaped by struggle, resistance, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Every generation inherits both the achievements and the unfinished work of those who came before. In understanding this conflict, we come to understand America itself, not as a perfect nation, but as one constantly redefining its identity. The Civil War stands as a powerful reminder that freedom must be defended, equality must be pursued, and unity must be chosen again and again. That is the true legacy of the Civil War, not just a chapter in history, but a continuing challenge, one that still calls on each generation to decide what kind of nation it wishes to be.